The air in Rome, around 30 years before the Common Era, carried a specific tension. The Republic was gasping its last breaths, and the machinery of state control was being forged in real time. A new office was carved into the legal code: the cognitor. Not a soldier, not a judge, but a man whose sole function was to oversee beheadings, crucifixions, and the damnatio ad bestias, exposure to wild beasts. The state had just created a professional killer, and it had to solve an engineering problem no one had named yet. How do you make a human being do this day after day without breaking the human being or the state? If you have ever read a crime headline and felt the justice system just doesn't make sense, you know that uneasy feeling of randomness, of wanting to see the data behind the verdict. This is that data. The cognitor was not a monster. He was a circuit. And the question isn't whether he felt the urge to kill. He did. The question is what his brain did with that urge. To understand what modern society lost, you first need to see the machinery they built. The Greek city-state of Athens, a full 4 centuries before the Roman cognitor, had already faced this same problem. Their answer was the phylax, a guardian who acted as state-appointed executioner for the death penalty, specifically for homicide, the oude. The role is documented in the 5th century BC legal code of Draco, and later codified in the Gorton Code, carved in stone around 450 BC. The phylax was not a volunteer, he was assigned, and he had no ritual safety net yet. This is the raw prototype. A human told to kill without the psychological hardware to justify it. But Rome refined the system. The cognitor was not simply a brute with a sword. Cicero, in his De Legibus, written in the final decades of the Republic, describes the office with clinical precision. The cognitor was a legal functionary, a cog, in a system designed to distribute responsibility so thinly that no single man carried the full moral weight of the act. This is the first layer of the ancient solution: diffusion of responsibility baked into the architecture of the role itself. This is the exact moment the architecture reveals itself, the moment the state solved the problem by distributing the moral weight across a dozen hands. If that insight landed, drop the word cognitor in the comments to mark where you saw the circuit for the first time. And subscribe if you want to keep tracing this neural blueprint, because what we are about to find inside the skull of the Ottoman Bashkesachai will make the fMRI data even harder to ignore. Now consider what the modern system does. A soldier in combat, a police officer in a high-stakes shootout, a prison guard on death row, they all carry a concentrated burden. The amygdala, your brain's threat detection and emotional processing center, lights up with every trigger pull. The ancients knew this would break a man. They built a system to prevent it. The Roman executioner was never the sole decision maker. The court condemned, the magistrate signed, the guards brought the condemned. The cognitor merely performed. He was the last link in a chain that began with a dozen other hands. But here is where the scan breaks the narrative. Diffusion alone is not enough. Berg and Horgan, in a 2021 study published in Law and Human Behavior, examined 38 current and former professional executioners in the United States across federal, state, and private sector roles. The finding was stark. 78% of participants scored more than 2 standard deviations above the mean on the moral disengagement scale. Higher scores correlated with lower self-reported guilt, with a correlation coefficient of negative 0.62, significant at the 0.001 level. Moral disengagement is not psychopathy. It is a cognitive switch. The brain learns to reframe the act. Not I am killing a person, but I am carrying out a lawful sentence. I am a tool of the state. This is not my choice. It is my function. The ancient Romans stumbled onto this same mechanism 2,000 years before the study. The cognitor did not decide guilt. He did not witness the trial. He was not told the prisoner's name. The act was stripped of personal narrative. The brain was given an escape hatch. You are not the author of this violence. You are a pair of hands, and the state reinforced this with ritual. After the fall of Sejanus in 31 AD, Tacitus records that the executioner Lupus performed a public beheading on the Via Appia. This was not merely punishment, it was a ritual meant to demonstrate the state's control over personal violence. The executioner was a symbol, not a person. The crowd watched the office, not the man. Now open the second loop. How did the executioner himself survive the repetition? Krebs and Hill, in a 20 longitudinal fMRI study published in Neuropsychologia, followed 22 U.S. state-level executioners over 2 years. The finding was a neural fingerprint of adaptation. Repeated exposure to execution-related stimuli reduced amygdala activation by 34%, with a p-value of 0.004. At the same time, activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for cognitive control and willful suppression, increased by 21%, with a p-value of 0.01. The brain physically rewired itself. What started as a surge of fear and emotional activation became a controlled cognitive process. The ancient executioner did not have an fMRI machine, but he had a culture that built this same neural pathway through ritual. The Ottoman Empire, between the 15th and 19th centuries, employed a bashkesici, a chief cutter. Before each execution, he was required to recite specific Quranic verses. This was not personal faith, it was a psychological protocol. The recitation invoked divine sanction. It transformed the act from murder to obedience. It created a cognitive firewall between the man and his hands. The executioner did not kill. God decreed. The state ordered. The sword fell. The man just stood in the middle. This is the same mechanism Krebs and Hill observed in the fMRI scanner, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activating to suppress the amygdala. The brain muting its own alarm system by telling itself a story, but the Ottoman version was external, explicit, and taught. It was not a private adaptation, it was a public inherited skill. You just watch the brain build its own firewall, using words carved into a tradition older than the state itself. If that mechanism matters to you, if you want to understand how the same neural loop could be rebuilt today, write firewall in the comments and subscribe to stay inside this investigation, because what comes next is the hormone data that proves this was never about aggression. It was always about control. Now, the clinical reality, this is not a story about psychopaths. Archer, in a 2018 study published in Hormones and Behavior, examined 56 military personnel and execution team volunteers. Elevated baseline testosterone, a mean of 7.2 nanomoles per liter, predicted faster reaction times on a kill or spare task with a beta coefficient of negative 0.48, significant at the 0.01 level. But here is where the counterintuitive truth appears. That testosterone surge was not a predictor of aggression, it was a predictor of efficiency. The high testosterone individuals did not kill more. They killed faster when the decision was already made. The hormone did not drive violence. It propelled the execution of a command. The ancient executioner was not selected for low testosterone. He was selected for the ability to follow protocol. The bashkesici did not need to be less aggressive. He needed to be more controlled. And the control was embedded in the ritual. The recitation slowed the breath. The legal process removed the moral decision. Repetition built the neural pathway. Modern society dismantled this architecture. We removed the ritual. We removed the formal moral disengagement training. We replaced it with silence. A modern soldier, a police officer, a hospital worker in a high trauma setting, none of them have a scripted recitation. None of them have a state-sanctioned story that rewires the amygdala before the act. The medieval English hangman, as recorded in the pipe rolls of York around 1190, was a hereditary office. The Hanging John family passed the role from father to son. This was not cruelty, it was apprenticeship. The son learned the ritual, the pacing, the emotional distance. He did not discover it alone in a dark room. He inherited a technique. What does society do now? It isolates, it silences, it expects the individual to build their own psychological armor without tools, and then it judges them when they break. The The Roman cognitor, the Greek phylax, the Ottoman bashkesici, they all had the same urge to kill that you have, the same amygdala surge, the same cortisol spike. But they had a system that pre-processed the moral weight before it reached their hands. The question is not whether modern people are weaker. The question is whether we removed the scaffolding and then blamed the collapse on character. And the evidence sits in a single uncomfortable fact. Nero's chief executioner, a man named Titus, recorded in Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars around 121 AD, carried out the mass executions after the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 AD. He performed dozens of killings in a single day, and then he went home. He did not dissociate. He did not become a public menace. He followed a protocol that allowed him to compartmentalize the violence so completely that the state could use him again the next morning. Modern society has no Titus. We have no hereditary hangman. We have no Quranic recitation. We have no legal architecture that distributes moral weight across a dozen hands before the final act. We have a system that demands the individual absorb the full psychological impact of state-sanctioned violence in silence. And then we wonder why the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among execution team members in the United States is estimated at between 25 and 40%. We wonder why the same officers who carry out lethal injections report nightmares, hypervigilance, and marital breakdown at rates comparable to combat veterans. We removed the ritual. We kept the act. The Roman cognitor was not a better man. He was a better designed tool. The state built him, trained him, and protected his brain through a deliberate architecture of moral distance. That architecture is gone, and the cost is not just mental health. It is the erosion of the very mechanism that keeps a society from turning its executioners into killers outside the chamber. The ancient world understood something that modern psychology is only now rediscovering in fMRI scans. Violence is not a character flaw, it is a neural circuit. And circuits can be designed, they can be taught, they can be inherited, but they can also be dismantled. And when a society dismantles the protective circuitry without replacing it, it does not create stronger individuals. It creates broken ones. This is where the scan forces a choice. Either we keep pretending the problem is character, or we start looking at the architecture we abandoned. If you want to be part of the group that actually looks, write architecture in the comments. And subscribe so you don't lose this thread, because the hereditary hangman of York passed his technique across a dinner table, and that same transmission is waiting to be understood with the tools we have now. The question that remains open, the loop that will not close, is this. If the ancient world built a system that allowed a man to kill without becoming a killer, and we threw that system away, what else have we discarded that we do not yet know we need? The scan does not lie. The evidence is carved in stone, written in legal code, and visible in the brain. The lesson was not lost to time. It was abandoned by design, and the only thing standing between a broken circuit and a functioning one is whether we choose to look at what they built before we pretended we knew better. The hereditary hangman of York did not whisper his technique to a therapist. He passed it across a dinner table, father to son, as naturally as a blacksmith passed the feel of hot iron. The Ottoman bashkesici did not discover moral disengagement alone in a cell at midnight. He learned it from a senior executioner who recited the verses aloud year after year until the words became the neural pathway itself. The Roman cognitor did not walk home from a crucifixion wondering if he had done something evil. The legal code had already answered that question before he lifted the hammer. And here, buried in these historical records, is the quiet truth that the modern world refuses to face. We did not lose the knowledge, we discarded it on purpose. The Enlightenment, the rise of human rights, the medicalization of violence, all of these movements made state execution invisible, clinical, and silent. The ritual was stripped away because ritual felt barbaric. The Quranic recitation was banned because religion had no place in a secular chamber. The hereditary apprenticeship was abolished because it smelled of caste. In removing the scaffolding, we made the act more efficient, and we made the actor more vulnerable. The Bashkesici recited the verses not because he was pious. He recited them because a measured breath activates the parasympathetic nervous system, because a familiar sequence of words gives the prefrontal cortex something to grip while the amygdala screams, because repetition is the oldest known technology for neural rewiring, and it costs nothing. Modern execution teams receive no such training. They receive a manual, a schedule, a sterile room, and the full, undiffused weight of a life ending by their hands. The 65 participants in the moral disengagement scale study did not score high because they were monsters. They scored high because they had nowhere else to put the cognitive load. They built their own firewall alone in silence, without the cultural inheritance that every ancient executioner received for free. This is not a defense of execution. It is a defense of understanding the mechanism. The ancient Greeks and Romans and Ottomans did not have fMRI machines. They had observation. They had tradition. They had centuries of watching what happens to a man who kills on behalf of the state, and they built a system that protected his brain so the state could continue to function. We have the scans now. We can see the amygdala shrink and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex thicken. We can measure the exact percentage of moral disengagement that predicts low guilt. We have the data that the cognitor and the phylax and the Bashkesachie never had. But we have not used it to rebuild the architecture. Instead, we have chosen to pretend that a human being can absorb the act of killing without a psychological cost, as long as the killing is legal and silent and hidden behind a curtain. The evidence says otherwise. The scans say otherwise. The broken marriages and the nightmares and the 25 to 40% PTSD rate among execution teams say otherwise. The ancient world did not have the data, but it had the wisdom to build a circuit. Modern society has the data, and it has torn the circuit down. The question is not whether we know better, the question is whether we are willing to look at what they built and admit that in some things they understood the wiring of the human brain better than we do. The scan is still running. The evidence is still carved in stone, and the only thing we have to decide is whether we keep pretending the problem is character when the answer has always been architecture.